Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining Business for America's briefing on the January Select Committee's hearings on the attack on the U.S. Capitol in 2021. I'm Richard Eisen with Business for America, our National Policy Director. And we're really excited to have four great panelists with us today to explore the meaning of the Select Committee's work, and particularly what that means to business and the health of our democracy. We wanted to hold this briefing in advance of the first hearing, which is on Thursday. That is the first of 6 hearings that the Select Committee will be holding over the coming weeks. And we wanted to do that in order to provide some context and background and some interpretation for our business colleagues and members about the significance of the hearings. Particularly the significance to the business community and to the health of our economy, political stability, and our democracy. And we also want you, in the context of this briefing, to think about what your company might do. We believe that business has a critical role to play in increasing political stability, as has been threatened by the January 6th events and the continuing threats to our democracy. And thinking about this in the larger narrative, we know that over the past 18 months since the insurrection, the level of rhetoric and attacks on business have escalated by certain politicians. And those attacks, in some cases, have resulted in punitive actions being taken against companies for taking stands on a variety of social issues, including voting rights. And unfortunately, we expect this kind of rhetoric and critique of woke capitalists to continue. And we encourage you to be thinking about how in your business you can play a more active role in defending our democracy. We'll be talking today in this briefing about some particular actions that your companies can take, including supporting an eventual bill to be introduced in Congress to reform the Electoral Count Act. Okay, so just a few housekeeping notes before I introduce our panelists. Number one, if you have a question, use the Q&A function. That we'll see that quickly. Secondly, we are recording this. And thirdly, we really encourage you to reach out to Business for America if you have questions, comments about how your company or business organization can participate in subsequent activities. Okay, so I'll just mention quickly that we have 4 great panelists today, and then I'll introduce them in a bit more detail as their turn comes. But starting first with the retired Ambassador Norman Eisen. Norm is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution in DC and the executive chair of the state's United Democracy Center. And I'll say more about Norm in a moment. We'll also hear from Kristy Parker, who leads the checks and balances team at Protect Democracy in Washington, DC. We'll hear also from former Republican Congressman Tom Coleman from Missouri, who served in Congress from 1977 to 1993, and Didi Kuo, who is at Stanford University and is the Associate Director for Research and Senior Research Scholar at Stanford Center on Democracy. So thank you all so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. And Norm, I know you have been involved in these Select Committee proceedings previously. You had served as a special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee for the Trump impeachment from February of 19 to February of 20. And you also served in the White House during the Obama administration as a special counsel and special assistant to the president for ethics and government reform. So Norm, as you think about what is about to transpire with these hearings, first, tell us what is the purpose of the Select Committee and how does that differ from an independent commission? Why do we have a select committee and not an independent commission, for instance?
Thank you, Richard. And it's so pleased to be, I'm so pleased to be with all of you, including to explain the origins, why this fork in the road between a select committee and independent commission like we had on 9/11. Part of the reason I'm so pleased to be here today is because of the great work that you and Business for America do, and of course my wonderful colleagues who are joining me on the panel, Tom, Kristy, Didi, all of whose work I admire. So just a pleasure to be with you. The answer to the question is that the bipartisan comity that has traditionally reigned when our nation has been attacked from Pearl Harbor to 9/11 was not able to be accomplished to have the consensual approach of a bicameral, that is approved by the Senate and the House, signed by the president, independent commission with powers like the bipartisan 9/11 independent commission. And that is not to say that the House committee, which was necessary because since we couldn't get a bill, an agreed upon approach through the Senate, the House constituted this select committee using its powers. That's not to say that we don't have a strongly bipartisan entity that is looking at the terrible events on January 6th, but also what led up to it and the ongoing threat we'll talk about today. And this matters so much for business. In a sense, these threats to our democracy, bipartisan threats, haven't ended. They're still burning strong. So the bad news is that we were unable to get bipartisan agreement. We thought we had it, and then it fell apart. The minority leader, Mr. McCarthy, who I've worked with a lot over the years when I was ambassador, he came to Prague for some projects that we worked on together, always had very good relations. He couldn't see his way clear. I think it was a terrible mistake because he now has no one answering to him who's on that panel. But you do have bipartisan representation. Liz Cheney is as strong a GOP voice, and I know from my observation, conversations with the panel, she is a fully empowered vice chair who is jointly managing the work of the panel with the Democratic chair, Benny Thompson. So, and of course, Adam Kinzinger, another Republican, independent-minded. Liz Cheney's extremely conservative. So the form is different. The bipartisanship is the same in practice. And I think we're going to see some very active voices from both sides of the aisle when we have our first hearing on Thursday.
And Norm, what can we expect to hear over the subsequent weeks from the committee members? I know they will bring witnesses to testify and to present. More subpoenas, I understand, may be issued. But what is your expectation of how things will unfold?
I think there are 6 hearings scheduled. The number could fluctuate up. I think of it as, having worked on the impeachment, I know how flexible these congressional calendars can be. But the first hearing, I would expect, will lay out, it's like a opening of a case to a jury. Except in this case, the jury is the American people, really. And so it'll lay out, here's what we're, the old saying, Richard, and your business leaders know this well from the presentations that they do to customers, to their boards, to the public. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them then tell them what you told them. So they're going to tell them in the first hearing, hey, here's where we're going. They're going to lay out a roadmap, and you'll hear, again, bipartisan in the best American tradition. I'm sure you'll hear from the chair, a Democrat, and the vice chair, a Republican, and an extremely conservative one at that. You'll hear the vision of where they're going. Then there'll be and they're going to do that. That's not going to just be blah, blah, blah. It's going to be very high tech. It's going to be like a mini series, you know, with images and clips of the testimony. They've taken testimony from over 1,000 people, very Netflix or Amazon Prime worthy TV in prime time at 8 o'clock on Thursday, to describe the events of January 6th, but the long lead in and how the threats to our elections are still continuing. And then I think you'll actually get to meet some of these very important witnesses, I suspect. So the American people can, again, it's like a trial. First, you have the opening, then you start putting on the witnesses and the evidence. But a gripping Perry Mason style trial, we all know that actual trials are not always that interesting. This will be made for TV, made for prime time.
Okay. And Norm, say just a little bit, based on your experience, about the concept of the rule of law and why that is particularly important in the context of what happened on January 6th and, you know, the ongoing threat, as you noted, to the health of our democracy.
This should be of an issue that is of paramount interest to our business leaders. I've put in the chat, and I'll put in the chat again, the paper that my colleagues, Bill Galston, who's a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and a Brookings scholar, but also Elaine Kmark, and I had the privilege of helping to commission and edit this paper, which is jointly from Brookings and the States United Democracy Center. I've just dropped it in the chat again. That the predicate to the idea of America, the nature of our democratic republic, the expression of America in our founding documents in the Constitution, who we are, the reason the world admires us is because we are a rule of law nation. That's not to say we've been perfect at every stage in our history. It's when I worked for President Obama, it's as he used to say, it's the striving for perfection that in every generation we try to do a little better. And the rule of law, having courts, independent rules, judges who actually decide the case, who aren't playing special favors, that's what makes America work. But it's why we're admired around the world, but it's why American business and American capitalism and our capital markets are so powerful, the most emulated, really the foundation of prosperity. By adopting the American model, the world has lifted so many billions out of poverty in the post-World War II system. Well, as Bill and Elaine explain at length, to the extent that the rule of law comes under pressure and we start to have clientelism, to quote the title of Didi's book, that we start to have this corruption, that it creeps over, that we have disrespect for the rule of law, that our elections are no longer trustworthy, that the candidates are picking their voters rather than the voters picking the candidates, that erodes the American system, including the capital formation, the ability to go to courts. It makes us less attractive to the rest of the world as a source for investment. So That's why it matters to the idea of America and the Constitution. We are a rule of law country. No person is above the law, but it matters to the idea of American wealth, markets, and capital also. We must have a reliable rule of law system and reliable elections, or the whole shooting match falls apart.
Right, right. Norm, thanks. We'll return to those themes, but let me move to Kristy Parker. And just as a reminder, folks, Kristy leads the Checks and Balances team at Protect Democracy in Washington, D.C., where she oversees work to strengthen Congress's Article I powers and to prevent abuses of executive power. Before joining Protect Democracy, Kristy spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice, so knows something about using the federal authority to resolve conflicts. Kristy, based on what Norm said, there are 2 Republicans on this committee and 7 Democrats, but it has been painted as a highly partisan effort by some, right? So is there any merit to that? As you look at who the staff is and how the committee process is working, what insights can you give us about that?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here today. And I have to say, as a former federal prosecutor, I was feeling very fired up just listening to Norm talk about this and what we're going to be seeing later this week. And I know this topic of bipartisanship is especially important to our business community. I consider American business to really be one of our institutions in this country. And sadly, I think it's one of the few institutions we have going right now that still is responsive and has to be responsive to the will of all the people. So I know it's really important to the business community that this committee not look like or be a partisan witch hunt. And you're certainly going to hear that. But, as following up on what Norm said, I think you really need to tune that out, because in addition to the bipartisan membership from Congress and, the leadership of a very prominent conservative, Representative Cheney, and as Norm knows, much of the work of the committee is really done by its staff. And the staff here is a truly, bipartisan, group of experts, former federal prosecutors, people who've worked across administrations as career civil servants like I was, people who were political appointees in both administrations. One of the lead investigative counsel on the committee is a former law clerk to Justice Thomas. So what you're going to see coming out of this committee and the presentation they make is really going to be reflective of what is a consensus among those experts in law enforcement that former President Trump and many of his high-ranking associates committed acts that meet the elements of various federal criminal statutes. And that's something that you can really trust and I think encourage other people to tune into, because this really is going to be reflective of the work of a lot of experts in this field.
Mm-hmm. And so as the hearings take place, will there be, do you think, a series of recommendations as to corrective actions that Congress can take, as well as steps that the Department of Justice might take?
Well, so in addition to its incredibly important fact-finding role, and the committee really has played an enormously important role here. It also has the mandate as our Article I legislative body to take what they learn during their investigation and either recommend new laws that can be passed or policy changes, to address the things that we saw and prevent them from recurring. So that really can run the gamut from they've certainly looked at, all of the various intelligence failures that took place that led to this not being, spotted in a timely way and allowing, our Capitol to not really be defended in the way that it should have been. But in terms of policy, there are really going to be a lot of things that they have to consider. They're going to want to be, plugging some of the holes that they see in our laws that are, people just didn't really anticipate happily for a very long time that we would have an attempted coup in the United States. So not all of our federal laws are designed to address every single thing that went on here. Although I will point out that there are some that absolutely do. And as I said, you're going to see that the elements are met for several of those. But I think one very prominent reform that will be looked at is certainly going to be just shoring up and updating the Electoral Count Act. What President Trump tried to do on January 6th, what he encouraged the vice president to do, was completely absurd under the current version of the law. But there certainly is no reason that that can't be shored up and updated to make sure that nobody even has a thought of doing such a thing again. And as we know, there are already bipartisan voices who have signaled a willingness to do that.
Can you just give us a short primer on what the Electoral Count Act covers and why it's important?
Well, just in a very general way, the Electoral Count Act is essentially the implementing statute for the 12th Amendment, which sets out the rules for the proceeding that takes place on January the 6th, and which, essentially dictates that, the vice president opens the envelopes and counts the votes that the states submit. It is not a process for undoing the work of the states. It is a process for opening the envelopes, counting the votes, certifying what the states have done. You obviously saw President Trump encourage the vice president that he had discretion not to do that. That is not so. But if we can make something even more clear than it already is, we should take that opportunity.
Okay, great. And Kristy, the jurisdiction of the Select Committee vis-a-vis the U.S. Department of Justice, could you tease that out a little bit?
Well, of course, the Congress is a legislative body. They have oversight authority. What they are doing here is an oversight legislative investigation. So they don't have on their own the authority to hold anyone accountable, but they certainly do have the ability to take testimony, to gather evidence that other prosecuting bodies, certainly to include the Department of Justice and maybe even some of the state bodies that are looking at Mr. Trump, can use. But they play an enormously important role in, as one of the players in helping to ensure accountability here. So the evidence that they gather is going to be evidence that the Department of Justice can use. And that's going to be really important, just underscoring again what Norm said about the rule of law. A close relative to that is the need to ensure accountability for even the highest ranking actors who violate the law. You don't have that, the rules don't apply to everybody, and you don't have a stable system. And what we've seen in the Trump years was he wasn't held accountable for obstructing the Mueller investigation. He wasn't held accountable for bribing President Zelensky. He bragged about being above the law, and then he tried to foment a coup. And that's not something that we can have in a rule of law society. And so this committee is really gathering that evidence that, in addition to what the Justice Department's been doing for a year and a half, is going to put us in a place where we can ensure that accountability happens this time.
Great. Thank you, Kristy. Good. We'll return to that. And again, folks, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A and we'll make sure we'll try to get to it. So let me turn to former Congressman Tom Coleman. Tom, thanks for joining us from Missouri. And Tom, you were in Congress in I guess, we might say a different era when there was more bipartisanship. Things were contentious, but maybe I think less so than they are now. And you wrote, I know, an opinion piece in 2019, in May of that year, declaring that the Trump presidency was illegitimate and that both Donald Trump and Mike Pence should both be impeached. And so as you think about the hearings that are going to start, and then, starting on Thursday, what are some things that, you can, that are most important for us to be thinking about, and, maybe reflecting on your time in Congress?
Well, Richard, thank you for being on this august panel here with these fine folks. I know of all of them and have done some dealings with Norm and other people here. So I appreciate it very much. I'd like to go back beyond and before my congressional experience, because I think the other big scandal in this nation's history was Watergate. And this panel that we see now in the select committee has Watergate to follow and maybe improve upon or follow it as they wish. But I was a young, very young, newly elected state representative in Missouri. And early 1973, I'm in my Capitol office and I picked up a copy of Newsweek magazine, and it was a little blurb. It wasn't a story. It was a blurb about this long, about some sort of burglary or break-in to the Democratic National Committee at a place called Watergate. Never heard of any of that before. But the media, thank goodness we do have and still have a media in this country that is not cowed, that went out of its way to make sure that the facts were presented enough so that the United States Senate would have to take action. And that's exactly what happened. It wasn't a third-rate burglary as they were trying to be tossed off, because it had links to the White House. So we had a similar situation. It wasn't a commission, and I agree with Norm to the extent that I personally believe we should have had an independent commission, because eventually I felt that they were going to be investigating some of their own members, and that may be exactly what's happening here. But you get it at a commission when you have bipartisanship and you have a buy-in by both parties. And both leaders of the Republican Party said, no, we don't want an independent commission where we will have the equal number of people on the panel as the Democrats do. So this week, they probably will come out and slam the committee for being partisan. The fact of the matter is, everybody wanted it to be bipartisan, more bipartisan, but they're the ones who scratched that. So let's don't forget that. But anyway, when the Senate started having its hearings, it, like Kristy said, it was part of their oversight responsibility, like the select committee here in January 6th. And so it was riveting TV for those of us who watched it. And every day it was on television, every day. It was during the day, not at night. And I know that the first one here is going to be at night, but the rest may be during the day. You never know what was going to occur. The testimony was not leaked to the press in many cases, and it was a surprise. And it was like a soap opera almost. Every day it was something new. And it was bipartisan. Howard Baker, who was a leading Republican, who eventually became the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, asked the famous question, what did the president know and when did he know it? That crystallized the entire segment of Watergate in many people's eyes. The end result was that people went to jail for lying under oath, for stonewalling and conspiracy. Even the former Attorney General of the United States served time in jail. So this is a little bit of a blueprint. But I do want to say that for what I see here now is the best of the two Republicans on this committee. I don't agree with everything that Lynn Cheney has ever done or voted. And I do think she's done an exceptional job here. And I think that we need to recognize that they're carrying a big load. They're doing what's right for the country and not for the party. And Richard, as you said, when I served in Congress, sure, we had our disputes, but we could come together certainly on saving our democracy. We never really had that call, but now we do have that call. And I think that the business community has been silent too long, that they need to step up. And like a lot of folks on this call, I also had business clients that I represented before Congress. So I know how they feel, and I know how their corporations feel about certain things. But it's time to step up. And I hope that through this session that we can stir some of those folks to make sure that their CEOs know what's going on, watch and understand the hearings, and do something about it, because we need to save our democracy.
Tom, I know you think a lot about sort of the health of our democracy and the trajectory. So could you be a little bit more specific with some recommendations that you might encourage businesses to be thinking about, actions they could take, and maybe some particular facets of the hearings that they might be looking at?
Well, I don't know how the hearing is going to be played out. And so I won't be able to answer that question, but I will say that too often the business community is always interested in their own pet issue. If it's the corporation A, if they've got a couple of issues and that's what they want to push and what have you. And I understand that, but we've got to get beyond corporation A and B and C. We've got to get beyond this to save our democracy and our capitalistic system. Our market-based system is only going to be viable if we have a viable democracy. Otherwise, I mean, you can see the authoritarian playbook today in some countries, and they don't have an independent private sector. There's no difference between the sectors, because eventually, and this is what the business community has to understand, is that they will not have rule of law, as is mentioned by Kristy. And if you don't have rule of law, you don't have contracts that will stand up or be enforceable. If you don't have contracts, you really can't control your own property. And the fact is, authoritarians love to take over private enterprise. And so it's time to wake up. There's a clarion call out here. I think, our democracy is in the 11th hour. And if we don't step up with all that we've got, and the business community is so key and important to this society, that we're going to lose the democracy along with our economy and everything that went with it. So that's my call to the business community. I know how hesitant they've been in the past to, quote, get in politics. Let's put that aside. Check your own little parochial issue at the door, and let's all work together to make sure that these guardrails are restored for our democracy, that we give support for the Electoral College Act amendments. Because in my mind, if the ECA is not amended, the blueprint is already there for the people who participated in the insurrection to do in 24 what they were unsuccessful in doing in 2020.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tom, let me just ask you to build on that point. There is a narrative that has evolved over the past year and a half, wherein Republicans have been accusing various businesses of being woke capitalists, sticking their nose into a variety of social issues and not operating in the lane of producing products and goods and services. And thus, some of them have faced punitive action.
Yes, they have.
So is that a commonly held belief, do you believe, in the Republican Party, or is that a minority of members from what you can tell at this point?
Well, one of the leaders of this kind of activity is the governor of Florida, Mr. DeSantis, a so-called possible presidential candidate in 24. I mean, he recently has done a couple of things that are just boggles the political mind. I wouldn't see how you would gain a whole lot by going after Disney World, that has 20,000, I think, employees in Florida, that brings in billions of dollars every year to their economy, and a lot of spinoffs to this, and going to war with them over what has been law for, I guess, 25, 50 years. I don't know how long Disney World's been down there. And he did that because he wanted to show that he was in charge. This is the authoritarian hard knock. But then the other thing that he got himself involved with recently that just smacks of meanness. The Special Olympics had their session down in Orlando, I believe it was. And this is where kids, as you know, from the Kennedy family have sponsored this for many years. And these are kids who have exceptional problems, but they want to participate in athletics, and they can do it against other people who have similar disabilities. And so they were on the edge of the session down there. It's a big deal. It's once a year. And they said because of the pandemic that they wanted all these children to be covered and mandated to have having their shots. And the governor said, oh no, we don't have mandates down here in Florida. And I'm going to poll, and I'm going to charge you $27 million for this activity down here if you don't conform to what I want. To me, this is just a little taste of what you're going to get in an authoritarian administration if we ever got one in Washington. So thank you, Mr. Governor, for showing us what you really are and what others want to emulate. Now, we'll probably see more of this from people on the far right.
Okay. Just a quick note. I just put in the chat a link to BFA Business for America's website, our new campaign to get businesses to support the Electoral Count Act reform. You can read about it. We've just launched a business sign-on letter and are working with a variety of Senate offices, including Senator Collins' office, on what will eventually become a bill at some point this summer or fall. So we welcome everyone's support. Tom, thank you for those insights. And Didi, let me turn to you. And your work at Stanford has, over the past number of years, really focused on the idea of what are the ingredients to a healthy democracy, particularly the rule of law. And you have also studied the decline of democracies in other countries, found some common factors. And, I remember we were talking recently about how the insurrection in January of 21 was not so dissimilar to what happened in Germany, maybe somewhat similar to what happened in Ottawa recently. And so why is this idea of the rule of law so important to a well-functioning economy from your perspective, and thus so relevant to a business's long-term success?
Well, thank you, first of all, Richard, for organizing this panel, and thanks to Norm, Kristy, and Representative Coleman for being on the panel. I've already learned a lot from what you said. I'm going to reiterate some of it, which is that democracy, at the very least, is a minimum procedure for selecting candidates according to the will of the people through a fair assessment of their vote. This is precisely what is under threat today. The neutral administration of the law is the cornerstone of rule of law and democracy. And that is what allows, like Representative was saying, contract enforcement. It ensures that we have successful property protections. And we have seen, not just in the example of DeSantis, but in Senator Ted Cruz saying he's not going to accept woke corporate PAC money, and Josh Hawley saying he's going to write, copyright legislation in Congress that also goes after Disney. Texas's social media bill was just struck down, but we are seeing a rift now in the Republican Party, which has a traditional alliance with business, between an extreme faction that does not support the basic democratic process and a more sort of traditional or establishment Republican Party that is probably horrified at seeing this rift occur between big business and the party itself. What I'm going to emphasize today is sort of, at a minimum, democracy relies on free and fair elections and peaceful alternation in power. So when you have election manipulation, or when one side tries to rig the rules to stay in power indefinitely, or to use violence to contest an election result, that is not democracy. And it's not partisan. Unlike many of the social issues that are driving some of the more public sort of responsiveness from business, democracy itself is very basic and therefore tends to go unnoticed by the public. This is why business plays a particular role in calling out subversion of democracy in a way that the public alone is somewhat inattentive to. We are now seeing a lot of action at the state level to politicize the administration of elections, to allow state legislatures more oversight over things like counting the ballots, and to criminalize some procedures around election administration, to go after people who don't find the right numbers of votes, et cetera. This is the kind of thing that is part of a template of democratic backsliding that has happened in many countries over the past 10 years or so, where leaders are elected to power through a fair democratic process, but once they're in power, they sow distrust in the democratic system. They often come to power by sort of opposing democratic institutions in general through sort of populist rhetoric that attacks all of the special interests and elites that govern the country. And then they use their time in office to usurp and politicize a lot of the rules and procedures that govern elections. We know that damage can be done through distrust of the election process. While majorities of Republicans think that Joe Biden was not the rightful winner of the 2020 election, it's even more problematic that there are sizable pluralities of Democrats who just in general don't trust elections. That kind of distrust can create an environment that is vulnerable to misinformation or threats about whether or not the elections were fair. January 6th was not just one day of violence, one episode that we'll be able to discount in the short term. Instead, it was an organized effort to reject an election result, a wholesale strategy to put pressure on state level election administrators to file, 60-something lawsuits about election fraud, and also a refusal to concede the election. To this day, President Trump has never said that he lost the election. And now we're seeing candidates in primary elections and high-ranking officials saying that they don't believe that Biden is the rightful president. So this extreme right that doesn't believe in democracy, it's not that they're partisan, it's that they actually don't think the democratic process is legitimate or viable. And they are willing to do a lot of damage to public trust in institutions along their way to consolidating power, which sounds hyperbolic, but is actually what's happening.
So Didi, we have a question that I want you to answer. What suggestions do you all have, starting with Didi, for how business leaders can communicate concepts like the rule of law and other complex issues about process, fairness, to rank and file employees who may see the committee's work as partisan and an attempt to go after the former president for political reasons? So how does a company's communications team start to craft messages that inform the workforce about these complex issues?
Well, I think the business community has already taken really solid steps in advance of the election in 2020, saying that they, believe whatever the process, whatever the result of the process will be is one that they trust. Right. And then when Trump refused to concede, they were all very outspoken. All the national associations, the Chambers of Commerce, the National Association, Business Roundtable saying, you have lost, it is time to concede. And then after January 6th, saying they would withhold funding to the members of Congress, the people in the Senate who did not want to certify the election. I think that at the very least, the communicating you can do is that the democratic process is fair and that you will support politicians who support the democratic process. This requires companies to look inward at their patterns of corporate giving and at the ethos that they lay out in their political engagement. Businesses for a long time have been involved in bipartisan giving, especially through trade and industry associations. They give somewhat equally to both parties, especially at the state level. I think it's time for businesses to rethink that strategy and how their government relations departments interact, especially at the state level with state Republican parties, and say, if you don't believe in the democratic process, we cannot, in good faith, give financing to those candidates or those parties while also claiming to support democracy in the boardroom or, in our business leadership.
And this can be done both in Congress and in state capitals, you're suggesting, correct?
Right. And I think the key is for communications within business to say what their principles are, like what are the democratic principles that they support. And that allows you to have a pretty clear bright line for which candidates you will and will not support, or which parties you will and will not engage with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Norm, let me come back to you and ask you the same question. You know, you've spent, I know, a lot of time talking to people who are on the committee. You know, you've been very involved in the process. And are there particular messages, maybe reflective of what Didi said, that you would offer businesses, you know, particularly those who would maybe help to frame a response or a message for the CEO of a company, acknowledging what the hearings are about? Is there some advice you would offer?
You know, I recognize the challenge that corporate leaders face in this critical moment in our history. That's part of why I asked Bill and Elaine to put their heads together, a veteran of the Clinton-Gore administration and a Wall Street Journal columnist, to talk about the kind of that shared middle. Bill, of course, you may know, was founder and original founder and co-chair of No Labels, and really represents, and Elaine does a tremendous amount of work with business leaders in her, including in her series that she runs at Brookings on capitalism and democracy issues. So I recognize the sensitivity. Let me say that Richard, if you'll permit me to say so, not everyone knows this about me. I don't approach this problem as some kind of a visceral partisan or never Trumper or some such thing. I actually, it's been publicly reported, I actually worked on the Donald Trump presidential transition, if you can believe that. Helping consult with them would be, I guess, the most precise. Politico found out about it and wrote an article. So that, because when he won, although it wasn't my candidate, my initial thought was, well, he's going to represent all Americans, and we have to come together as all Americans. So I say that all by way of predicate, that I do not approach this from a sharply partisan perspective when I'm not. It's not only Brookings, but the States United Democracy Center, which I co-chair with Kristy Whitman, one of my co-founders, very proud conservative Republican, Northeastern Republican, but still, it's still a proud Republican. So, and she's my, someone I work with every day. Tom, I think I may spend more of my time working with Republicans nowadays than I do with Democrats, because we have to come together without a partisan regard and acknowledge the very real threat that our democracy is facing. And what I would say to business leaders is, each of them is going to have to put this in their own words. But if American democracy truly comes off the rails, and we have, for example, in this election cycle, we have hundreds of candidates or bills, quite a few, governor, United States senator, attorney general, secretary of state, from coast to coast, who believe that what happened in 2020, the power to simply ignore the votes and substitute a candidate and everything else that comes with election denial and with the former president's attempted, his own words, attempt to overturn the election, as he put it. That is going to be devastating for your company, for all of your stakeholders, for your employees. We will see more and more of the pressure of the kind Governor DeSantis is putting on Disney and other companies. and the pressure on the rule of law, the deterioration. If those elections deteriorate and judges are put under pressure, as happened in 2020, they resisted. So now is the moment to find the words to say, we stand for democracy, to make decisions such as, you know, if a member of Congress supported overturning the election, if they wanted to, if they voted to reject a slate of electors that we all know was lawfully chosen, there should be consequences. Should you really be supporting them? If you're in a state, your business is headquartered or operates in a state where these election denial bills or candidates are gaining power, make your voice known through institutional investors, the holders of capital. That's another opportunity, the large pension funds. Work with, be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. So there's many specifics. The words, Richard, every CEO and every corporate officer and communications advisor, inside or outside, is going to have to find their own words. But it's not just the words, it's the deeds also.
Yep.
And I say that in a firmly nonpartisan and bipartisan way.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that summary.
Richard,
Tom,
could
yeah,
I jump in for just commenting on Didi and Norm's things?
please.
We criticize politicians for putting party over country, and those who want to do just the opposite defend themselves by saying they're putting country over party. We need to have corporate heads put country over corporation, their corporation. They need to work together. And as Didi mentioned, the associations is a great place where you can hide if you're a corporation or if you're an industry. Your fingerprints aren't on a lot of things, but the association's fingerprints are. But those associations are run and contributed by individual corporations. So what I would say is make sure that your associations that you're involved with, that they got the word, that you give them the word. You know, there's a small example, but there were millions of dollars contributed to the Republican Governors Association in the last year or two before the insurrection. And on January 5th, they sent out a robocall paid by one of the Republican contributors of $150,000 to come to the Capitol. And then we're going to march to the Capitol. And these are attorney generals. These are people who are supposed to keep the law, a rule of law, as Norm says. And yet they were involved with this. And there were big name corporations that made those $200,000, $300,000 contributions. So, it all starts with the mindset of putting your own corporation behind our country. Put the country over your corporation for the short term, or for the long term, you won't have a very viable corporation in the future.
Right. Thank you, Tom. Kristy, anything you want to add to that? I'm sorry, you're on, good. Oh, you're still on mute.
There we go. Sorry about that. I just, endorse what everyone else said. One of the things I used to do when I was at the Department of Justice is I actually traveled all over the country enforcing laws that applied to government officials. And I mean, everywhere in the country, Kentucky, Ohio, Kansas. And I would talk to juries about this isn't about Washington, D.C. This isn't about politics. What it's about here is a set of rules. And, I would ask people when they would serve on juries, or be in line to serve on a jury, is there anyone here who thinks that the government, the police, anyone with the powers of the state should not follow the same laws that you all have to follow? And for the most part, everyone would say, no, I don't believe that anybody should be above the law. And I really think that that's what this is all about, is making our Constitution and our laws, making the words on the piece of paper a reality. And the folks that are on this call today are really vital to that. They standing up and insisting that the law be enforced. We can all have our disagreements on policy, but we have to come together around, we have a certain set of rules. Our voters decide elections, and when somebody, rightfully loses election, they have to transfer power to the winner. And, just what everybody said, that's what keeps us a free society and makes it so that our businesses can thrive.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Well, folks, I know we started a little late, but I do want to try to end very close to time here. So just, by way of quick summary, Business for America as a national not-for-profit, we work with businesses to help strengthen and protect our democracy. And we do that in a number of ways. One is supporting nonpartisan political reform initiatives like the Electoral Count Act. So again, I'll just refer folks to the chat where you can find a link to a recent letter that we just have put forth for businesses to sign on to. We also work with companies to support their Get Out the Vote initiatives for their employees and or customers in the communities within which they operate. And we also have an initiative about civic health, where companies can help support a more literate population who knows about civics, who knows about all the details that Kristy and Norm were particularly talking about, this is how the system works. There are 3 branches of government, and the more people that understand that, the healthier democracy we have. So companies can certainly play a critical role in strengthening our system, and we encourage you to all be in touch with us at Business for America to explore that. So Norm and Tom, Kristy, and Didi, thanks so much for your time this morning, this afternoon. We will be watching along with you the first hearing on Thursday, and maybe we'll get back together in a few weeks and have you all dissect what we've learned, over that period of time. Okay, well, thanks again so much, everyone, and have a good day there. Thank you.